Rarely is the question asked, is our children learning? This infamous Bushism delivered to a room full of students and teachers at a South Carolina school sadly is reflective of what we can expect to see from a heavily overregulated education system coming from the federal level. Which brings us to the question, what can we do to help curb this overregulation? The answer lies within the proposal before us today to implement a 12-year moratorium ceasing all functions of the United States Department of Education and return the authority for regulation and oversight of education to the states. We can see that this proposal is a step in the right direction when we examine two issues closely related to this subject area. First off, we must look towards the fact that this proposal will help to maintain constitutional integrity. Secondly, we must realize that in the case of federal regulation of education, less is more. We begin by examining the 10th Amendment of our very own Constitution when we realize that it states that the powers not delegated to the United States by the Constitution, nor prohibited by it to the states, are reserved to the states or to the people. What this means is that programs like No Child Left Behind and Race to the Top are blatantly ignoring the 10th Amendment of the Constitution. Ladies and gentlemen, I have to ask you, where in our Constitution does it refer to the ability, the authority, or the right of the federal government to regulate education? The answer is, it doesn't. So we can clearly see that by removing the power of the federal government to regulate education, this proposal is maintaining constitutional integrity. Now, we must look towards the fact that in the case of federal regulation of education, less is definitely more. According to a February 9th, 2013 article from the New York Times, since early last year, the Obama administration has granted waivers to 34 states and the District of Columbia. A similar report coming from the Department of Education at ed.gov referred to this waiver status, also known as Education Agency Flexibility Status, or ESAE status. What we need to realize is that states are already taking great steps in the direction towards regulating education themselves. The report from the Education Department stated that 34 states were granted status and 44 states applied. This means that well over half of the union, including the District of Columbia, has taken steps to preserving their ability and their right to regulate education, because they know best what is best for their students and for their teachers. So today we have to vote in the affirmation of this proposal when we see that it does two main things. First off, it helps take steps to maintain constitutional integrity, and secondly, it begins to realize the fact that in the case of federal regulation of education, less is definitely more. I'd like to take this time to address some of the perceived cons that I can see coming from this proposal. First off, I believe that many speakers will have an issue with how the federal student aid would be distributed, such as Pell Grants and FAFSA. So I would address this by referring them first to the section in the proposal for action clause stating that the funds that are currently allocated for education would be given directly to each Department of Education by the House Budget Committee. What I would tell them furthermore is that by doing this, we can expect to see that the states would have the same amount of money as before. However, it would be cutting out the bureaucracy in between them. Also, I would state that the fact that this proposal, as its nature of a resolution rather than an actual piece of legislation, would not necessitate a specific clause for distributing of these funds, and we can hope to expect to see an agreement between the states fairly distributing these funds and allowing them to be used by students from future legislation itself. Another major con that I can see is that senators would state, or speakers would state the fact, or would state that they did not believe that State Departments of Education would be able to actually address the issue of education itself. And I would refer them to a Times report from June 8th of 2008. Now, what this is actually referring to is stating that No Child Left Behind was doomed to fail because it was a reactionary step to deal with the fact that that the Bush administration did not want to be compared to the Clinton administration as far as the lax nature of the Clinton administration on education. And I'd also refer them to a Center for Effective Collaboration and Practice report stating that social problems and policies directly impact our educational agencies. And as such, educational trends seem to be victim to political and economic tides. We can see this effect would be dampened by the removal of the federal government from this process. Now finally, I'd like to conclude my speech by addressing one more positive for this legislation. I'd like to state that according to a report from the National Association of Elementary School Principals. The Budget Cut Act of 2011, under the sequester, suggested that a 5.1% cut to the total budget of the Department of Education would occur. This would be equivalent of $2.6 billion. And I would also refer to a United States Department of Education report outlining their budget, stating that S&E costs, or salary and expenses costs, were incurred or were expected to be incurred in 2013 of $1.67 billion, almost achieving $2 billion. So by eliminating the Department of Education, we could hope to avoid the negative effects of budget cuts to come from the sequestration. So I conclude my speech by reminding you to vote in the affirmation of this proposal because of the fact that it hopes to maintain constitutional integrity by removing the federal government from education regulation, because of the fact that in the case of education regulation, less is more in the case of the federal government, and finally because this will help offset the costs of our budget.